Billie Holiday's story is not one for the faint of heart. Her estranged husband dealt her nothing but heartbreak during her lifetime, though he saved the worst betrayal for her darkest moment. But at the same time, she had a fighting spirit and a voice like no other. From adversity to scandal to the bitter and heartbreaking end, there's little doubt that Billie deserved a lot better than what the world gave her. Billie Holiday's tragic end can only be matched by the flurry of drama that surrounded her birth. In 1914, Sadie Harris, then still in her teens, got pregnant. Her parents kicked her out of their home in Baltimore, and she fled to Philadelphia. It was there, in 1915, that she gave birth to a daughter. On the birth certificate, she listed the father of her child as a waiter named Frank DeVise. It was there that the trouble began. DeVise instantly disappeared from Sadie and the baby's life, but it's possible that he had a good reason. While Billie's mother Sadie listed one man on her daughter's birth certificate, the truth was much darker. Billie's father was actually a teenage banjo player named Clarence Holiday. However, within hours of her birth, all that was moot. Her mother's brother-in-law picked up Billie, then known as Eleonora, at the hospital and took her to his mother in Baltimore. It would be a hard road from there, and a long time before Billie even met her mother again. Billie's mother was in and out of her life for the next decade, but even when she was in, she only made things worse. In 1928, Billie's mother left her to move to New York City. Despite their fractured relationship, Billie chose to follow her the year after that. It would be a life-changing adventure, but it would begin with a grave mistake. Billie's mother, Sadie, worked the streets, and Billie joined her in a night house. The authorities eventually performed a raid on the place, detaining both mother and daughter. After a judge convicted her for prostitution, Billie had to spend 5 months on Welfare Island, toiling in the workhouse before they released her. She found her way back to her mother again, but she also discovered something important about herself. Spending her teens in a house of ill repute exposed Billie Holiday to a lot, mostly bad. But that experience was also what first exposed her to jazz music. By the time she was in her teens, Billie began singing in nightclubs and quickly gained a following. This shift also led to a surprise from her past, as her music career brought her in contact with fellow musician Clarence Holiday, her estranged father. The jazz world offered Billie salvation, but her climb to the top was filled with missteps. Billie's agent landed her a prestigious gig at the Grand Terrace in Chicago, but her big chance quickly turned into a disturbing scene. After the theater manager asked her to speed up the tempo of her singing, she got into a violent fight with him that ended with her throwing a hefty inkwell at his head. She was promptly fired, but of course, she eventually got her revenge. Later, when she was the hottest act in jazz, the same manager begged her to come back to the Grand Terrace. In classic Billie fashion, she told him that she wouldn't perform there if it was the last venue on earth. When she got the chance to, Billie happily told off those who wronged her. However, as we'll see, there were often disturbing consequences for her behavior. Billie Holiday was supposed to perform one cold March night when she received a chilling phone call. The person on the other end of the line told her that her father had died 7 days earlier in Texas, and the circumstances were absolutely horrific. Clarence Holiday had fallen ill while on tour, but hadn't been able to find a hospital to treat him because of his race. By the time that he got to a veterans hospital in a Jim Crow wing, it was too late. Although their relationship had been distant, Billie had always revered Clarence. The loss left her devastated. While the world had taken many shots at Billie, it still hadn't totally beat her down. So she picked herself up and did her best to move on. By the time she was 16, Billie Holiday had already had plenty of terrible experiences with men. But everything about Bobby Henderson was different. Billie and the innocent young musician fell hard for each other, and even years later, Henderson spoke of her in reverent tones. They seemed like a match made in heaven, and it's rumored that they were engaged. But sadly, their union was doomed to a heartbreaking end. They both kept hush-hush about it. But in 1932, the papers began to report that Billie and her fiancé had separated. This was definitely a painful one for both. But Bobby's reaction was utterly bizarre. The day after the breakup, he was supposed to record with Billie's producer, but he never showed up. He then changed his name and disappeared from jazz music completely for 20 years. For her part, Billie dealt with the breakup in a classic way, with a terrible rebound, of course. Billie's friends had hoped she'd end up with someone nice like Henderson or pianist Sonny White, but instead, her next conquest was Jimmy Monroe, a friend of legendary gangster Dutch Schultz. The company he kept wasn't the only problem. Monroe was an avowed hustler with a taste for opium and coke. He quickly passed that on to Billie, and as we'll see, it had devastating consequences. Addictions weren't the only problem that Billie had to negotiate at this point in her career. She had a brief stint singing for Count Basie before they fired her for being temperamental. However, there's a hidden side to the story. It seems more like the band resented her for standing up for herself. She complained about bad pay, even worse working conditions, and the grueling tour schedule. Terrible problems, sure, but they were nothing compared to her next gig. Next, Billie met clarinetist Artie Shaw. He needed a boost to get his band into the big time. Her suggestion was unusual and daring for the time. She told him to hire a black singer for his white orchestra. And the black singer she had in mind? Herself, of course. It was a huge gamble, but Shaw, who had experienced prejudice as a Jewish musician, was willing to make it. However, neither could have predicted exactly what kind of maelstrom their professional relationship would go on to cause. Billie Holiday wasn't stupid. She knew that her presence on stage when Shaw's band played in the segregated South would cause waves, so she planned to mitigate the damage by keeping a low profile on tour. Still, it had to wear on her when venues required her to use separate entrances, or sit alone in a room away from the band when not performing. Her final straw was absolutely infuriating. It was one thing to deal with that kind of treatment in the South, but when the owner of the Lincoln Hotel in New York City, where she lived and performed for so many years, tried to pull the same thing, Billie's blood boiled. Billie Holiday and Artie Shaw had come together to make their mark in jazz, only to see their hopes continuously disappointed. Their feuding record labels hardly helped, and after the infuriating incident at the Lincoln, Billie made the decision to leave the band. It was a huge disappointment, and one that came with a decidedly heartbreaking lesson. Billie's style of singing went against what was popular at the time: loud, fast songs and lyrics performed by a big band. It was the swing era after all. Her style was the opposite of that. The realization that she'd never be a commercial hit was a disappointment for Billie. But it was also freeing. She was finally able to perform and record songs that best suited her incredible voice without worrying about what other people thought. The freedom served her well, and brought to her a song that would not only alter the course of her life, but also cause jarring changes all across the country. The iconic and controversial Strange Fruit. Although many think that Billie Holiday wrote Strange Fruit, the song that became her signature, it actually began as a poem penned by a Jewish schoolteacher named Abel Mirapol. He wrote it as a reaction to the lynchings that were rampant in the US at the time. When Billie read it, she thought of her beloved father, whose untimely loss was directly connected to racism. In 1939, she adapted the poem into a song. She had no idea just what impact it would make. Billie first performed Strange Fruit at Cafe Society in New York City, but she feared potentially violent reactions from people who objected to the song's message. And she wasn't the only one. Her record label, Columbia, didn't want to record it, dreading the backlash from record stores and other affiliates in the South. Still, Billie refused to back down, so she came up with a plan. She turned to another label and forced Columbia to make an exception from her contract for the one song. The effect was immediate. The song became a protest song unlike any other. One that, instead of rousing its audience, chilled it to the bone. Soon, protesters working on an anti-lynching campaign were sending copies of the record to the congressman. Critics worried it would cause a wave of lynchings, while some venues tried to get Billie not to perform it. She hadn't backed down before, and she wasn't about to start. New performance contracts included a clause that guaranteed her right to perform the controversial song. She'd finally found her way in music, but it came with a brutal side effect. With the success of Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday gained prestige, publicity, and for the first time, some good money. Sadly, it went straight to supporting her and her boyfriend Jimmy Monroe's bad habits, pushing them deep into addiction. Their relationship caused major drama with Billie's mother, Sadie, who, despite her own issues, saw Jimmy for what he was. Fed up, Sadie told Jimmy to get out. Well, this impulsive move backfired spectacularly. The very next day, Billie Holiday returned to her mother's home and slammed a piece of paper down on the table. It was a marriage certificate. She tied the knot with Jimmy Monroe the night before. Sadie was devastated, and Billie took off with Jimmy, finding a place of their own. And then, instead of a honeymoon, the newlyweds suffered a terrible experience. Authorities detained and sentenced Jimmy to a 12-month sentence for marijuana possession. Billie tried to get lawyers to help him, at least at first. Then everything crumbled. Billie eventually caught on to the fact that Jimmy was, in fact, a total scumbucket. Maybe it was the year apart, or the fact that he soon fled to California and took up with a bevy of different women. Either way, she took no time in moving on from the toxic relationship, and right into another. His name was Joe Guy. No, really. And while he didn't have the same penchant for infidelity that Jimmy did, he did have an affinity for substances. Boy problems weren't the only ones overwhelming her either. Strange fruit had thrust Billie into the spotlight. But due to her lack of education, having dropped out of school at 11, she shied away from politics. However, that didn't stop her from fighting the racism she experienced the only way she knew how, with her own two hands. When a naval officer spat a racial epithet at Billie, she broke a glass bottle on a table and brandished it at him. The message was clear: don't mess with Billie Holiday. Unfortunately, not everyone got it. When Billie started making money from her music, she wanted to spread it around. As one of her friends said, she fed everybody in New York for about 4 years. But family came first. Billie bankrolled a restaurant for her mother Sadie, a plan that quickly blew up in her face. She kept having to lend Sadie more money, and when Billie fell on hard times herself, Sadie's reaction was brutal. She absolutely refused to give her daughter a cent. The two had a huge fight. Not the first, but sadly, it would turn out to be among the last. After seeing the effect that addiction had on her daughter, Sadie had once said that watching Billie lose herself in substance misuse would cause her own early death. For a while, it looked like Billie would prove her wrong. She underwent detox treatments, but then everything spun out of control. Sadie passed in 1945, and the results were catastrophic. Billie's grief sadly pushed her back towards old habits. In 1946, filmmakers cast Billie in a big Hollywood movie called New Orleans, opposite Louis Armstrong. Sadly, this dream come true quickly turned into a nightmare. Prejudice and the Hollywood Red Scare forced the filmmakers to cut all but a few minutes of footage of Billie and Louis. This was all done to diminish the role that black people played in creating jazz. It was a total disaster, made only worse by Billie's experience on set. Billie was in the brutal throes of addiction while making New Orleans, still reeling from the loss of her mother. She was spending all of her $1,000 per week salary as it came to her, and that wasn't the saddest part. Her boyfriend, Joe Guy, followed her to Los Angeles and provided her with scores. When her manager caught him in the act, he had Joe barred from the set. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. Eventually, Billie's issues with substances came back to bite her. The consequences were not only disastrous, they also sealed her eventual dark fate. Billie had flown under the radar with the authorities for a while. They finally arrested her in New York City apartment for possession of narcotics. Her lawyer didn't even show up to defend her, and she began suffering the effects of withdrawal. Weak and dehydrated, she pled guilty and begged to be taken to a hospital. But there was little relief on the horizon. Abandoned by her lawyer and treated horrifically by the authorities, things got so bad that the district attorney begged the judge on Billie's behalf. Eventually, the judge sentenced her to a federal prison camp for women. The repercussions didn't end there. Billie also lost her New York City cabaret license, which meant that she could no longer perform in venues that served drinks. It was a harsh blow to her career, one she'd really have to struggle to come back from. After nearly a year behind bars, Billie Holiday got out early because of good behavior. She flew back home, where her friend and her dog awaited her at the airport. The dog was so excited to see her that he knocked her down and smothered her with kisses. The commotion didn't stop there. A bystander who thought the dog was attacking her screamed, and as a result, a crowd gathered, eventually attracting a group of reporters. Billie was back, but she worried that people would have trouble forgiving her for her sins. Billie Holiday was always unapologetically herself, but her tough facade hid an anxiety that the public would judge and condemn her for. Well, at least at that point, she had little to worry about. Her manager convinced a reluctant Billie to perform a comeback show at Carnegie Hall, which immediately set a record for advanced ticket sales. The show was a huge success. During the show, an audience member sent a box of white gardenias to the stage, which had once been her signature. Billie picked up the sprig of blooms and fastened it to her head, not realizing she'd punctured her skin with the hat pin until blood was pouring down her face. The show was an overwhelming success, and the sold-out crowd demanded more and more from Holiday. After 3 curtain calls, Billie returned backstage and promptly collapsed. A successful, if short, Broadway run followed, but Billie still had to pay the price for her stint behind bars. Despite her success in alternative venues, Billie's loss of her cabaret license severely damaged her potential earnings at a time when the crowd was hungry to see her perform. This left her with no choice but to go on grueling tours in order to make money, which had a dire side effect. Before long, Billie had relapsed, and the tour was thus struck by multiple catastrophes, including a brawl and another arrest for possession. She got out of it, but the fix was in, and the law was determined to bring her down at any cost. There was, at least for a short period, a turnaround for Billie Holiday. Her second husband, Louis McKay didn't suffer from the same issues that her previous exes had, and he seemed like an overwhelmingly positive influence on Billie, at least at first. In reality, he had a chilling dark side. While he kept her clean, his day job was a mob enforcer, and he bled her finances dry. Sadly, that wasn't the worst part. Louis was also abusive. The addiction, the drinking, and the terrible relationships were taking their toll on Billie at a rapid rate. While with Louis McKay, Billie Holiday suffered hits both physical and psychological. He was so violent that she sometimes had to tape up her ribs before performing. Louis also tried to get control of her body of work, so that if she just happened to die, he would profit. Somehow, that wasn't even the worst betrayal. He also secretly conspired with her biggest hidden enemy. Why did the authorities have it out so bad for Billie Holiday in particular, when there were plenty of celebrities using all kinds of illicit substances in those days? Well, it was all the work of one man. Harry Anslinger. Harry Anslinger was the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he spent years of his career trying to bring Billie, among other jazz musicians, down. How can we be so sure that it was driven by race? Well, when it was brought to attention that Judy Garland had a terrible substance problem, he met her, told her to take more time off, and then reassured her movie studio that she wasn't an addict. Yep, that's how absolutely awful this guy was. Depression was already creeping in, forcing Billie to retreat from the world, when disaster struck. In March of 1959, one of Billie's oldest friends, Lester Young, suddenly passed on. It's difficult to overestimate just how long their friendship lasted and just how close they were. Lester had been the one to nickname her Lady Day, and she called him the Prez. Billie was torn to pieces by the loss, and then insult was added to the injury. Billie requested to sing at Lester Young's funeral, but his widow refused to let her. A heartbroken Billie was still allowed to attend, where she paid her respects to her old friend. According to a friend who rode with Billie to and from the funeral, she made a cryptic prediction after the service. She allegedly told him, "I'll be the next one to go." She couldn't know how right she was. Just a few short months later, Billie collapsed. When she went to the hospital, doctors gave her a devastating diagnosis: cirrhosis of the liver, which came mostly thanks to her drinking. As a diagnosis, it's both painful and difficult to control without kicking all relevant bad habits entirely, something we know Billie had trouble with. She quit drinking for a while, only to relapse. Sadly, this was just the beginning of a dark end for the singer. In the final years of her life, Billie Holiday became increasingly paranoid and suspected that government agents were out to get her. The sad part is, as we know, that she was totally right. When she was hospitalized after her relapse, a cadre of federal agents ignored her frail state and barged into her room, making a false claim that they'd found illicit substances in her home. Billie Holiday always had fight in her, but in these final days, all her strength had been sapped. What came next was a horrifying injustice that's gone down in infamy. After her visit from the agents, a grand jury indicted her, which meant that she was placed under arrest, handcuffed to her hospital bed, and watched by police guard. As if that wasn't awful enough, Anslinger ordered doctors to stop giving Billie the methadone, which had been helping her with withdrawal symptoms. Many view Anslinger as being directly responsible for what happened next. After 2 months in the hospital, a priest gave Billie Holiday last rites, and she passed on as a result of complications from cirrhosis. She was only 44 years old. It was a bitter and ugly end for a woman who'd possessed immense talent, beauty, and sadness. But her story didn't end there. Billie's estranged husband, Louis McKay, had dealt her nothing but betrayal and heartbreak during her lifetime, but he saved the worst insult for her after she was gone. When Billie passed, she only had 70 cents in her bank account and less than $1,000 to her name, mostly because of Louis' spending. As if that wasn't bad enough, burial arrangements fell to him, and he was a total cheapskate about it. A wealthy fan offered to have her buried in a fancy Manhattan cemetery with other celebs, but Louis refused, and he didn't stop there. Louis instead chose to bury Billie next to her mother. Sweet, right? Wrong. All that she got was an unmarked patch of dirt. No tombstone, not even a marker. In 1960, a jazz publication pointed out the sad situation of her resting place, chastising all the people who'd made money off her only to leave her at Louis' mercy. They offered to raise money for a stone, but Louis, a prideful jerk, refused. Eventually, he relented and got a shared tombstone for Sadie and Billie. She may have suffered at the end, but you see, her legacy came to speak for itself. Billie Holiday sadly spent her final years broke, depressed, and underappreciated. She couldn't have known just how much the world would change in the years she missed out on. While Billie's style of music hadn't exactly been all the rage during her lifetime, Both critics and fans came to appreciate the stark beauty of her songs after she passed. Album reissues, Hall of Fame inductions, and even statues came in one by one. Now, her legacy as one of jazz's greatest voices is locked in forever, as is her position as one of its most controversial figures. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.